Thanks, Sarah. Okay, great. We are launching our next poll ahead of the next session. So please have a look at that now for all those online. And good afternoon and welcome to those who are also just joining or tuning back in. And for those who don't know me, my name is Cameron Hunter and I'm a director for the Young China Watchers London team. And I will encourage my panelists to turn on their videos now and we can begin the next session. So this next panel discussion will be looking at the Indo-Pacific region and the implications of this construct or framework for regional security and for China specifically. So what I found really interesting is to see the evolution of this idea of the Indo-Pacific and recent attention this region has received from many countries around the world. Even in the UK's own integrated review that came out this year, a pivot towards the Indo-Pacific was announced as part of the Global Britain strategy. But I'm intrigued as to what effect all of this attention, in what form it is manifesting and how China perceives this neighbourhood focus from an array of world powers. So in order to unpack these ideas, I'm delighted to be joined by two preeminent experts in this field. Andrew Chubb is a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at Lancaster University. He is currently undertaking a 3-year investigation into the role of domestic public opinion in international crisis diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific. Originally from Australia, Andrew brings a perspective direct from the Indo-Pacific region. Raffaello Pantucci is a Senior Fellow in the International Centre for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, and a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defence and Security Studies in London, or RUSI if anyone is UK based. Raffaello is also one of Young China Watch's co-founders and is calling in live from Singapore at a terribly late hour. So thank you and welcome to you both. We see the initial poll results have come in there and I'm seeing quite a mixed response for the first question on who is the most influential actor in the Indo-Pacific region, but quite a strong response for question 2 on strategic contestation there for the primary consequence of the concept of this Indo-Pacific. So we'll come back to those questions at the end of the panel and see if anyone's mind has changed after this. So I'm just going to start with an opening contextualizing question for both of you. The UK, Germany, the Netherlands and France have all recently devised their Indo-Pacific pivots and strategies, all of which contain direct or indirect references to China and the maintenance of the international rules-based system. So how should we understand this focus, this growing focus on the Indo-Pacific region, in particular from a security point of view? And does China have a role within it? So I'm going to go to Andrew first.
Thanks, Cam. Well, thank you for having me. Thanks to YCW as well. Congratulations on another great event. I've got very fond memories of Young China Watchers events back in Beijing. Enough years ago now that the old friends, if they're out there in the audience, probably don't recognize me because I actually had hair last time I was with Young China Watchers, but nonetheless, it's great to be back. It's a really big question that you've posed there, Cam. And I'd also tack on to that. You listed out several European countries, including the UK, that have sort of developed these Indo-Pacific strategies, but somewhat surprisingly, pleasantly surprisingly, I suppose, from the perspective of a lot of regional observers, the EU itself has released an Indo-Pacific strategy this year. A draft version, I think, in April, and then a finalized version in September. So, you know, the trend is probably is gathering momentum based on that evidence. What explains the trend? I would say, well, I'm going to offer 3 explanations, and we can debate what the relative weight of each one is. Firstly, I tend to see it as primarily a product of the Trump era, but I can't prove this for reasons that I'll come back to at the end when I kick it over to Raf. This is just my personal interpretation, but I think the Trump era created two particular impetuses for European states to start to think strategically about the Indo-Pacific. One is obviously the increased geopolitical tensions that have accompanied Donald Trump's administration. They pose direct risks to very, very important interests of EU states, the sea lanes of communication, and frankly, the risk of war or regional instability that could have major both geostrategic but also economic implications. Secondly, I think the downplaying or sort of trashing even of alliances in Donald Trump's foreign policy, such as it was, created a greater need for the EU and also for its member states to sort of figure out how they were going to look out for their own security interests across the world, but including in the Asia Pacific, where a lot of things are happening, where a lot of change is occurring. And then also, I think the sort of heavy military emphasis, looking at the EU's strategic documents. I haven't looked closely at the Netherlands one, but there's a German one as well. And I think my impression, based on looking at through the EU's one, is that there's a contrast with the American Indo-Pacific strategy, with a heavy kind of security military emphasis. And I think that gave, in particular, Germany a kind of motivation to kind of come to the table and offer up a different kind of strategizing, or a different kind of strategy, one that sort of more explicitly tries to identify and protect those security interests. At the same time, many of them are shared with the United States, but also perhaps in a less sort of in-your-face way on that front, and at the same time also one that fully embraces an economic component. Remember here that the US, at the same time as sort of going hard on its own Indo-Pacific strategy, has been withdrawing from the TPP, the primary sort of vehicle for deepening trade ties in the region. And also on the technological and sort of values or principles side, which was very much absent under Donald Trump. So there's a contrast there between the way that the EU has gone about it, and hypothetically or speculatively, I think the EU and its member states have been trying to offer up an alternative kind of Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's the first factor that I think has been most important, or at least that's what I'm arguing. The second factor, obviously, rise of China, and that's created major strategic impetuses for European states to think in a strategic way about the region. China's military buildup has altered the balance of power. US and its allies' control of the seas is increasingly in question, and in ways that the EU and its member states wouldn't be comfortable with. There's China's assertion of a very divergent reading of the UNCLOS, a very important international treaty that the EU and its member states support, and challenges in the economic dimension as well, the Belt and Road Initiative, which Raf will probably say more about since he's written a book about it, and technological standards and things like that really worry the EU in China's strategy. So, and that's a big part, I think, of the sort of the systemic rival designation in the 2019 strategic outlook that the EU put out a couple of years back, that sort of presaged a lot of the subsequent strategizing. And then the third factor that I'd mention is related to what Cameron was talking about in the introduction. I actually think that the Indo-Pacific concept itself and what it does in terms of merging of the Indian and Pacific oceans into a single geostrategic theater, I think this has itself been a driver. And what I mean here is that Europe was actually already quite active in the Indian Ocean, particularly in maritime security initiatives for many years going back, particularly around maritime domain awareness and capacity building and protection of sea lines of communication. And so when the primary theater of geostrategic competition is expanded to include this area that the EU is already working in, it's understandable that European states would at least, at a minimum, want to go about restating and reformulating what those interests and activities are going to be in that redefined geostrategic theatre. So I've figured the number one driving factor as being Trump, and sort of in a context of a rising China and the rise of the Indo-Pacific concept. The interesting sort of thought experiment that comes out of that speculative hypothesis of mine, and a question that I'd like to kick over to Raf and for other experts and the audience out there, is whether these Indo-Pacific strategies that we've seen from European states in recent years would still have happened if Hillary Clinton had won the election. Would she? I mean, she would have certainly still withdrawn from the TPP as part of her election platform, and she would have been more hawkish than Obama. But at the same time, maybe the degree of coherence would have in the US strategy and the coordination with the allies would have been such that the EU would have felt less of a need to get as involved as it has. That's again just a hypothetical, and with that, I'll kick it over to Raf, who knows more about both EU foreign policies, but also the Belt and Road and the kind of broad geostrategic side of things.
Thank you, Andrew, so much for that. Very interesting hypothesis there on Trump and Clinton. I'll hand over to Raf now for his thoughts.
Well, thank you, Cam, and congratulations to YCW for organizing this event. It's an immense pleasure for me always to participate as a speaker in any YCW event, having been there since the beginning. So thank you guys for putting on such a great conference in London. And, you know, and thank you also for putting me on a panel with Andrew, who kicked me over a question which made me think a lot, actually, and actually it's kind of stirred me off what I was initially going to say. So I'll switch to instead try to respond to it, because I think it's a really interesting question that he puts out there, and it's a hypothesis I can understand and I can appreciate, and I think there is something to this narrative that, you know, the EU and European powers in general have been trying to push towards what they term strategic autonomy. You know, and this is kind of a long-standing fear that you find in Europe, which is, you know, we're too dependent on the Americans. You know, we need to be a more autonomous power. We're a country, you know, the European Union as an entity is as economically powerful as the United States. It's got as many people as the United States. Logically, it should have the same kind of weight. And so the fact that they find themselves constantly kind of following American policy on so many things, you know, does generate this anxiety, you know, which, to be perfectly honest, often emanates from the halls of power in Paris and then sort of filters out to all the others. But, you know, it does have this sense of we have to, so I think there is something to that narrative that says that, you know, the development of all these individual Indo-Pacific strategies at a European level and at an individual member state level is in part generated by a kind of push by the United States. But where I might diverge a little bit would be to say, I wouldn't say that this started under Trump. My view would be that you could track back to the Obama administration, where they started to talk about the idea of an Asia pivot, something that was, you know, christened by a man whose name I'm forgetting, Kurt Campbell, you know, Hillary Clinton's famous advisor in the State Department, who, you know, had really sort of crafted this idea and was really behind this idea of pushing American foreign policy. And this is very much a sort of Obama era idea of we need to get ourselves out of the quagmires in the Middle East that we can't seem to get out of and try to focus on where the real energy in the world is these days, which is Asia. And so the desire was to kind of refocus attention out there. And, you know, Obama sold himself as the Pacific president, you know, having spent a chunk of his childhood in Indonesia and so on and so forth. And so when you start to reorient yourself, you know, towards Asia in this way, you know, China naturally becomes the big story. You know, I think that kind of, you know, brings me on to the next point, which is, you know, all of these, you know, European countries have, and at the EU level, have clearly developed these Indo-Pacific strategies, in part in response to, you know, what the United States is doing. And they always, no matter how hard they try, will find themselves dragged along by the sort of centrifugal forces of American power around the world, but also by a reality that, you know, Europeans are not stupid and realize this dynamic is changing of world influence and power. And Asia is the rising place. And this is where you see great economic might, you see great future things happening. You've got India and China, two behemoths, you know, which are only going to grow as time goes on. You've got lots of other, you know, countries that we often forget, like Indonesia, Vietnam, you know, Myanmar, which are, you know, Myanmar maybe not a bad example of that, but, you know, you've got lots of booming economies out there, which are doing really well and are real opportunities. And so there's a real desire by Europe, I think, to try to engage more generally with the region. And that's why when you look at these documents, you see they do avoid a direct mention of China. And on the one hand, this is because there's a desire not to antagonize China, because there's always this recognition of trying to strike a balance between, on the one hand, engage, and on the one hand, see the economic opportunities, but on the other, recognize that there is a kind of a problem with this power which acts in very hostile ways and undermines direct European interests, but also undermines American interests. And at the end of the day, the United States remains the European Union and Europe's sort of preeminent strategic ally on the world stage. And so there is that recognition of the hard security side, but also I think on the ground in Asia, there is this complicated balance you have to strike where, if you go in just pointing fingers at China and seeking conflict and confrontation, which was very much a narrative, I think, that did come out of the Trump era, you're setting yourself up for a situation where on the ground in Asia, you're not going to find that many takers, to be honest. You will find people in most capitals who are concerned about China and are very worried about their overdependence on China and, Chinese action and belligerence around the neighborhood. But at the same time, while we talk in the West about the importance of the Chinese economy, that's multiple more relevant for neighboring countries to China, who are entirely dependent on the Chinese economic, mission to sort of continue to grow and survive. So from their perspective, the idea of China being seen solely as an adversary is not a good thing. But on the other hand, they don't want to find themselves trapped under China's heel. And this is where I think the sort of harder edge to the discussion and discourse in Europe and the United States is important to always consider. The engagement in Asia, and the Indo-Pacific strategies in general are really about trying to recognize, I think, on the one hand, you can look at it through the light of just seeing China as the adversary and confronting them. But on the other hand, it's really about saying that the center of kind of global economic gravity and the center of kind of the global economic conversation has shifted east. And if you're going to engage with that story, you have to engage with it. And you can't just engage with it by saying, well, we're just going to make money here and then go home. You have to engage with it on multiple levels. And that's why there's a requirement to also engage at a strategic level and at a security level. And this is why you see, powers like the United Kingdom signing agreements or creating these agreements, AUKUS, with the United States and Australia. Ironically enough, I'm very glad that Andrew brought up the fact that the EU had also launched its Indo-Pacific strategy, because of course it landed, I think, the day before the AUKUS announcement was put out, and sort of it completely took the wind out of the sail of what had been a sort of long-standing European push. And one has to wonder a little bit if there was some sort of politicking going on there, but we unfortunately don't have the ears of the people who knew those details at the time. But I think what's undeniable is that it did, AUKUS reflects a realization by the United Kingdom that, one, their big strategic ally of the United States is making big security plays there, and they want to be with there as part of it. But the United Kingdom has also sent its battleships out to the region, to sort of do freedom of navigation operations, to make port calls around the region. But we've also seen European powers doing this as well. The Netherlands and Germany have both had ships going through the region recently. And I even believe the French have as well, but I have to say, I have to stop myself there because I don't know the exact details of it, but I do know that for sure that the Germans and the Dutch did. So we have got this kind of general push, and this general push that you see is really about recognizing the importance of this area and recognizing that if you're going to engage in this area, you can't just be either a profiteer or bellicose. You have to find a way of engaging on both levels at the same time, because that's what the region wants. And that's what will give you the capability to ultimately engage with the region in a way that will ultimately suit your advantages. To trace back a little bit, to talk sort of more about China, which is of course we're at a Young China Watchers Conference, and China is a sort of key element here within this conversation. Is I think that the complexity in some ways of all of these responses, I think from a European and from a US level as well, is that you have continually got this complicated factor with China, which is that on the one hand, this is the world's boom economy, the world's big economy, and the one that's still growing and has done reasonably well out of COVID as far as we can sort of tell. The slowdown has happened, but not maybe to the level that everyone expected. But it is also a power that has become increasingly aggressive, belligerent over the past few years, in particular in its sort of immediate neighborhood. And that causes complications. And that is why you see this sort of balance having to be struck. And then maybe to sort of end on a note, touching on BRI, which Andrew very kindly flagged up my upcoming book, which looks at, well, I've written a book already about sort of the Belt and Road Initiative more broadly, but I have another one coming out early next year looking at China and Central Asia in particular. I think there's an interesting dichotomy there to be looked at, which is the degree to which we see Western powers, the European Union, European powers, and the United States really pushing this sort of dual narrative in the seas, but really not engaging over land, where the Belt and Road Initiative really comes out as a relevant thing. So if we look at, the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the consequences of that, is really that the United States has pulled out its one major strategic interest that was in the sort of middle of the Eurasian heartland, and left instead a region which is now surrounded by, Russia, China, and Iran, three countries that are all, very much sanctioned by the United States and the West, in the sort of, the axis, if you will, that is sort of seen as the other side in the sort of global confrontation that we see at the moment. And in that space, we don't see this competition happening at all. And that is the space where we see the Belt and Road really playing out and really having influence. And actually, I would argue that there is the same kind of appetite there in those regions to have Western engagement in the same way, but it just hasn't happened in the same way. And it seems as though we're, the sort of Indo-Pacific strategies that are crafted are all so focused on the seas, they're forgetting that Asia has a whole landmass as well that is just not engaged with. And I think this is a massive deficiency, frankly, that really strikes out across the board, because this is, a Eurasian heartland, which ultimately directly connects to Europe. So it's directly relevant to sort of European powers in particular. But if we look at the security interests that play out there as well, if we think about countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, these are countries that have sadly created problems for us in the West in terms of terrorist problems and other instability. And to just sort of abandon them and say, well, let's leave it alone and let the Chinese sort of have a full sweep of this entire area, and leave those dynamics to play out as they are without ever engaging them in this sort of big strategic way, I think is really missing a beat. And I think that is the real sort of lacuna, I would argue, in all of these sort of wider Indo-Pacific strategies, and that they're so singularly focused on the maritime domain, with sort of occasional references to the land one. They entirely miss that, a vast part of Asia is on land and is in the Eurasian heartland, and is an area that, frankly, we should be looking to engage and, contest with as well. And I will stop there, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thanks, Raf. That is definitely an interesting distinction when you look at the Belt and Road Initiative having its land road, its land belt, its maritime road, and its digital Silk Road, and maybe a polar road as well. That you compare that to the Indo-Pacific focus, and it is just purely maritime. Well, at least in the broad sense, it looks at the waters. You also mentioned as well, something I want to come back to, the sort of the EU and the UK and those who are formulating their Indo-Pacific strategy are looking at the region in general. It is India, it is ASEAN, it's not just about China, it is thinking economically as well. However, I wonder if you have any insights in how China or the Chinese leadership, or even just sort of Chinese media, are interpreting the term Indo-Pacific. The more we talk about it, does that serve to heighten a threat perception within China? I wonder if either of you have come across any sort of insights on that.
Yeah, I can have a stab at that. I think as there is in most societies, there's a distinction to be drawn between elite opinion and popular opinion, and between sort of high-level decision makers' discussions and the discussions of their advisors, the sort of foreign policy elites, versus the media. I do think that among the intellectuals and strategists, Indo-Pacific is generally just sort of equated with US and allied, US and its closest allies strategy. It's almost always, Indo-Pacific strategy. The Indo-Pacific, rather than being referred to as a region as such, it's that Indo-Pacific is the strategy that America and its allies are employing in order to attempt to dilute China's influence by redefining the region, to bring in India, and generally an exclusivist type of reading of the Indo-Pacific. And there are other readings out there of the Indo-Pacific, particularly I'm thinking of Indonesia's reading of the Indo-Pacific, which is much more inclusive, certainly doesn't exclude China. And many in the US strategic community will argue that, you know, there is no Indo-Pacific without China, is one of the refrains that you hear. But I think that's the way that it's perceived among the strategic elites within the PRC, based on my, you know, surface level understanding. On the media side, there's actually a contrast there. I find the media discourse in China to be sort of surprisingly, I'd describe it as objectivist, in the sense that sort of like in the English language media, a lot of the time, it's referred to fairly uncritically, as though the Indo-Pacific just exists, rather than being a, you know, carefully hotly debated and carefully constructed and contested political construction. It's somewhat surprising, given that it's been seen as being equivalent to US and other hostile powers from Beijing's perspective, their strategy. It's sort of surprising that you don't see scare quotes around it more in Chinese media discourse. You know, Chinese media discourse are, as well as China's foreign ministry and official discourse, they're very fond of using the scare quotes. You know, that they'll call something 所谓的 in Tai. You know, if they think it's a intensely negative thing, or something that is purely associated with an adversarial or an adversary's interests. But we actually in the Chinese media discourse, that's surprisingly absent. It's often just referred to as though it exists. So actually, I've found that interesting as to why the propaganda strategists haven't essentially required Chinese media outlets to treat it sort of skeptically and put scare quotes around it and use 所谓的. I don't know what explains that, but it's a contrast with the strategic discourse in China, and it's a point of commonality with the Western media discourse, which sort of treats it as a given. I don't know, Raf, what was your take on that?
I think that's a very interesting observation, Andrew, and I think you've captured something there. I mean, maybe the explanation I would offer would be that I think it feels almost, I mean, in the Chinese discourse, I think it's a given that America is the adversary, right? And so if we start with the assumption that America is the adversary and therefore whatever they do is adversarial and that's kind of the end of it, then do we need to put scare quotes around it? Because it being linked to the United States and the United States being the principal adversary, then it is already in itself. And that's tended to be I think your perception of how the elite certainly analyzes, or it has certainly concords with my experience. You know, generally the Indo-Pacific is seen as synonymous with United States strategy, and therefore it's seen as the enemy, and that's kind of the end of that. I've seen very little attempts to try and engage. But I think what's curious about the Indo-Pacific strategy, of course, is a concept. In so much as I understand it, it initially was something that was developed by the Japanese, actually. You know, something that I think Prime Minister Abe proposed, some time ago, and then it just kind of didn't take off. But then it took off under, the Trump administration. He decided to sort of go big on it and build it up into what we know and deal with today. But it's, and in a way that would add, I suspect, to the sense of perfidy within the framing from a sort of Chinese perspective. This isn't just concocted by the evil Americans, it came from the evil Japanese as well, and that gives them a sort of additional layer of sort of hatred around it. So my only explanation I could have for your interesting observation there would be that it's just such a given that America is the enemy, that whatever they do is already adversarial. The point is already made by simply referring to it.
And also the Japanese connection that you mentioned, that's quite right. It was Shinzo Abe that put it forward in 2007, the confluence of the two seas. But in this same Indo-Pacific strategy period that the PRC has been responding to, the PRC has been pursuing, stable and increasingly sort of warmer ties with Japan. So to the extent that it's actually associated with Japan, perhaps that's part of the explanation for why they haven't treated it more harshly in the official discourse.
And just on Japan and Japan's sort of activities or participation in the Indo-Pacific, obviously being part of the Quad network with Australia and India and the US, that they engage in sort of naval activities. Is the Quad essentially a byproduct of the Indo-Pacific security focus from Western and Japanese countries, would you say?
You want to go first, Ruff?
I'm happy to have a crack at it. I think, you know, the Quad is something that has, again, been around for a little while. I can't remember exactly when it was first sort of advanced, but it's one of these sort of groupings that was, you know, developed, which brought together, you know, this sort of idea of these democracies in Asia getting together, you know, to worry about the Chinese, let's not pretend. Otherwise, it was really driven quite heavily by that. But I think what in some ways, what was always interesting about the Quad in particular as a grouping was actually India, because India was often the most hesitant of the bunch to be as confrontational with the Chinese as the other three. You know, the Australian relationship with China, and Andrew here, I'm sure knows a lot more about this. I mean, you know, the Australian discourse in China has gone in a very negative direction more generally. And I think that is something which has been coming for a while. And the sort of desire to confront there has been there for a while. In America, it's kind of been building up for some time, but it's really come to a head now. And Japan had a very confrontational relationship with China and wanted allies to try to support it. And as Andrew pointed out, that has sort of shifted a little bit at the moment. But India was always interesting because India was always willing to participate in this, but India was always hesitant to let the Quad really be an anti-China grouping because from their perspective, their relationship with China was complicated. Their economic relationship with China is very important. I mean, India, you know, has, you know, benefited substantially from Chinese investment, you know, and now the sort of wheel has completely turned and the fight is really on. And I would argue that in some ways, the reason that you can see the Quad getting sort of brought into this Indo-Pacific discourse is really more about a change in Indian perspectives than it is in change in all the others' perspectives. I think the others have broadly stayed along the same trajectory. It's India has become much more, you know, tense in its relationship with China and decided actually it really wants to join these sorts of alliances. And I'd say, where does it fit into the sort of broader Indo-Pacific vision or strategy or concept, if you will? I think it's really, it's part of what I would argue is a constellation of kind of groupings you see around Asia that are being put, you know, that are often linked to the United States in some way, which is really about the US developing all sorts of different groupings in the region to advance their interests, and often to, you know, I think from a Chinese perspective, and probably correctly to some degree, this is seen as a form of attempts at containment. You know, the idea is the US is building up alliances of different structures, because the realization, I think, in Washington is not all allies have the same view on China and on the region. And we have different equities with each one. And so rather than try to create some sort of harmonious, you know, NATO of the East, you know, that was tried once before, CETO, it didn't work, you know. So rather than try to recreate something like that, they say, well, why don't we build a whole series of different groupings and alliances? And I think Quad is one of those that had kind of stagnated, frankly, a little bit, but then was kind of picked up in this new surge of interest in Asia, and really took off as a result of that. I would argue, as I say, in particular, because India's perspective shifted.
I think that's quite right. It's not coincidental that India became keen after the Doklam crisis in 2017, the first of the two major border crises with China of the last few years. More serious than any of the periodic little flare-ups that had been seen since the 1980s, really. But there's an interesting history of the dynamic within the Quad, and I think to go to the question that Cam posed at the beginning, the Quad certainly emerged right. You know, the initial quadrilateral security dialogues came right after the confluence of the two seas speech in 2007. I think it was 2008 that they held the first quadrilateral security dialogue. And what stalled it, interestingly enough, was that India decided that Australia was not reliable enough, and that Australia was, under Kevin Rudd at the time, that Australia was pursuing economic interests with China was unwilling to essentially progress the Quad process, and that that Australia couldn't be trusted as a strategic partner in balancing against China. And it took many years of Australia adopting an increasingly confrontational stance before India became convinced that Australia wouldn't end up opting for the Chinese trade relationship over advancing strategic cooperation through the Quad. So that the two are the Indo-Pacific concepts and the Quad dialogues are definitely very closely. They're very close histories.
It's a really interesting way of sort of piecing all the bits together and how they're categorized and where they've come from and where they're going to now. So it certainly makes you think of what's maybe the next evolution, the next iteration of these constructs. But I want to, we'll also open, to the audience. Please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll come to them. But I want to go back as well to China's own military and naval modernization. And I wondered if either of you or both of you could sort of tell us where on that journey China is at the moment. There's always so many goals so far in the future about where China wants to be in terms of capabilities. And I wonder, how far down the line are we there? Perhaps Raf, Andrew first.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of very basic points on that. It's often alluded to in media reporting and strategic analysis that the PLA Navy, that China now possesses the largest navy in the world by number of ships, and that's true enough. But there are limitations. Limitations in terms of it's technologically, it's far behind the US, but also the number of ships is somewhat misleading because by tonnage, the PLA Navy is actually still well behind the US Navy, primarily because the number of aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers are just orders of magnitude larger than other kinds of ships. And then the other major limitation that we need to bear in mind with China's naval development is it's incredibly inexperienced. They haven't fought in even they haven't fought any sort of major naval conflict since the navies existed, and the one naval conflict that they have fought in the last sort of 40 years was a skirmish over Johnson South Reef in 1988 against Vietnam, where it sunk a couple of antiquated Vietnamese boats. And aside from that, the PLA has barely fired a shot in anger. So that's a major disadvantage when you're looking at the possible adversary being the US Navy, which has plenty of global experience in war fighting over the last 40, 50, 60, 70 years.
I'll pick up on that. I think the one observation I would make about the PLAN in particular, the PLA Navy, is, if you go back and look at history, traditionally in the Chinese military, the land force has gotten the monster budget, and this was historically a problem, frankly, because the land force, was just a hive of corruption. The PLA was this giant institution in China, with these generals who were, buying positions, logistics. If you looked at the sort of breakdown, the logistics structure was where just money seemed to just disappear in its incredible fashion. You know what I mean? And this was just people feathering their nests everywhere. And the PLA is a big army. You know what I mean? You're talking millions of people, and so you're talking about something which has a giant structure. And I think one of the things that we've seen happen under Xi Jinping is an attempt to try to rein this in. And we've seen some very, very, very senior generals, members of the Central Military Commission, go down in investigations, getting pulled down. And this is, we forget that old phrase when Xi Jinping came in, he was going after, tigers, not flies, I think it was, right? And that this really happened in the military. And I think a big part of that was basically trying to bring this under control. And the problem was that the land force was swallowing most of the budget, and a lot of it was disappearing into corruption. So bringing that to heel and trying to reform the other structures meant that naturally within the system, the other structure will start to get more money. And if you're talking about a navy needs boats. A navy is only so good as the boats that it has. And if it has no boats, then it doesn't really have a navy. And this is a country which is, at the moment, the world's second largest economy on the world stage, has got national and global interests. It needs a kind of naval force to go alongside that. So I think this is why you see this surge in some ways. And so it's an element of explanation I always like to consider within the growth of the PLAN, which I accept, is certainly not, they're not building a sort of Pacific force here. And by Pacific, I don't mean the sea, I mean, the peaceful force. They're definitely building an armed force here, and that is something to be concerned about. I can understand why everyone is very worried about it. But I also think we have to bear in mind that there is probably a degree of rebalancing happening within the Chinese services, as there is an attempt to build up, Marines capability, Air Force capability, rocket force capability, and naval capability, because so much previously was only going to one force that was incredibly corrupt and incredibly inefficient and not very good at what it was supposed to be doing, and also hadn't been tested in war. So I think this is why you see this sort of growth in some ways on the PLA, and it's an element that I think is always worth bearing in mind, because, this isn't to downplay the sort of potential bellicosity of the force and the fact that it is an army that's being built up there. But I think we have to consider it within the context of the PLA more generally, which is an army which is in the midst of a substantial changeover that's been going over the past few years, and was something that's very much generated under Xi Jinping's reign.
Quite right. And just to tack onto that, when you mention change in the PLA military, the change in the force structure to the joint theatre commands rather than separate services has huge implications for the PLA's overall warfighting ability. It's been a reform that's been desired by the PLA strategists for some decades, looking, this is how the US fights wars. We fundamentally need to do it that way. And those impediments that you mentioned, Raf, really got in the way of it because it requires a major diminution of the role of the ground forces and a boosting of the role of the services, the PLA Navy and the Air Force. And under Xi Jinping, that has finally happened. It was launched in 2015, the restructure, and PLA put out a new military strategic guideline, I believe, this year, one of the highest level documents that really kind of caps that off, and is a strong sign that this time the reforms have been at least much more successful than any attempt in the past, and that has major implications for the PLA's overall ability to fight wars in this Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you both. That's really interesting dimensions to consider when we think about the overall military and naval capabilities, and also the direction that they'll be going in the future. We have a question in from the audience, or a couple questions actually. Yao Ming asks if you can comment a little bit more on India's shift from a non-aligned position to where it is at the moment. What are the main factors which gave the impetus for this change in its strategic approach?
I offered my take very briefly on that with regards to those two border crises. So why don't you go on that, Raf?
Sure, happy to. I mean, I think the border crises was certainly a big component of it. I also think that you have seen the relationship with Pakistan. This is something that is a constant irritation and concern to the Indians, and they've been frustrated by what has been happening in Pakistan and don't think it's getting any better. And so from that perspective, when they see the Chinese so overtly bolstering Pakistan, they frankly will turn away. I also think that there's something to be said here for the Trump administration unlocking that relationship with India to a degree that you hadn't really seen before. Now, the US-India relationship, I think, is, at a very simplistic level, we characterize it being two democracies seeing eye to eye, and that's the end of it. But the truth is that, for good reason, I think people in the United States, strategic thinkers in the United States, look at India, with a skeptical eye in some cases. This is a country whose army is principally based off Russian equipment. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a major supporter of the Russian army, of the Indian army, and there still is a very close connection there. And there's always a degree of concern about weapons sales, for example, that the United States gives to India, ultimately ending up in Russian hands. And so that dynamic always puts a kind of strategic question mark in some ways in the United States over India. The other, to be honest, is an issue that you've had, and this is something that's really become acute under the Modi administration, which is this, frankly, the abuse and persecution of minorities that does unfortunately happen with India, with some degree of, unfortunately, state or parties close to the state sanction. And human rights abuses are a real problem. And what happens in Kashmir and what happens around the country is something that causes great consternation in the United States, which does try to advance a foreign policy which is based on values and based on human rights protections. Now, I think what you saw happen under the Trump administration was a real willingness to basically turn a blind eye to that entirely. There were some moments when the Indian government under the Trump administration, there's some pretty awful things happening in Kashmir. They changed the legislation on Kashmir's position within India. And in the wake of that, there was a lot of condemnation because it caused a certain consternation. Now, it's worth looking at the history of the relationship between Kashmir and India a little bit more, because it's not as simple as it's often painted. But I think the fundamental point was that there was a certain degree of concern internationally around the human rights abuses and the problems that had happened of military forces there, and frankly an attempt to try to protect the Kashmiri people and what they were suffering. And what was interesting was, after everything happened there, the Indians made a big lobby to try to get others to come and visit Kashmir and do things there. And what was interesting was the United States openly engaged in that under the Trump administration, whereas the European Union refused to. And they were very hesitant. And this caused some frictions in relation to India and the EU, but it really helped warm things up again between India and the US. And so I think once you saw that relationship starting to warm up a little bit more, and you saw under the Trump administration, they pushed through a whole series of agreements on the military and defense side with India, which really kind of bolstered that relationship in a really quite transformative way. I think this, on top of the clashes, which Andrew very correctly pointed out, which were much worse, frankly, than things that we've seen in the past, where people were dying, and there was real sort of problems and on borders that are still disputed and will probably be for a very long time, but that really escalated. So this concatenation of events, if you will, the sort of things with Pakistan being a problem, the border clashes being worse, and the relationship with the United States getting tighter, meant that I think you saw an Indian government that was more willing to really shift itself in a really conclusively strategic direction closer to the United States. The one codicil I'd add to all of this very quickly would be the Russia relationship, which is still very strong in Delhi. And I think that's going to be the part which is still going to slightly complexify this as we go forward. I'll stop there. Thank you. Over to you, Andrew. What do you think? More than Doklam and...
Well, yeah, it's nice to have you picking up on the Trump thread this time, and advocating for Trump as part of the explanation. I do also just want to add to that, that if you look at the global polling results from the Pew Global Research Center, you find that, Donald Trump was famously unpopular around the region and even in US aligned countries, but he was very popular in India. So that, public opinion factor was certainly helped to sort of facilitate the tightening of those relations. And I think Indian public opinion is sort of more skeptical towards broadly still, I think, favorable towards the US under Biden, but more skeptical of the Biden administration than it was of the Trump administration. So that's an interesting little coda to that.
That's great. I was going to ask if there was, much continuity under the Biden administration, because I think so much can be put down to Trump and Modi's sort of personalities as leaders in how they shape relations, both in the US and in India domestically, whereas Biden is a whole different operator. But there's another question in, so let's move on from that one. How has COVID impacted the diplomatic relationships between neighboring countries and China? Is there less dialogue? Who would like to take that first? Raf.
I can take a crack on it. I'm sitting in Singapore where there's been I think it's very interesting, because I think COVID is, a huge issue, and, it's something that has, I don't think it's really changed relations between China and the region at all. I think what it's done is accentuate in some ways some things that were kind of already there. And it's been a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. I think the Chinese did quite a lot in sort of an attempt of, vaccine diplomacy and other things around the region. And, to be honest, a lot of Southeast Asian countries are relatively poor, and frankly, will take whatever is coming. You know what I mean? They need help. Now, so if it's medical equipment, if it's vaccines, they'll kind of go with that because they need it, and they will just accept wherever it comes from and move on. Now, I think what's problematic in some ways, or what's proven to be complicated in some ways, is that what countries have discovered as they've gone along. And Indonesia is a very good example of this. Indonesia kind of went big on getting the Chinese vaccine to start with. They used it, and it turned out to not be as effective, frankly, as they were hoping. And there was a real problem in the health sector in particular, where doctors were dying as a result of COVID, even though they had been vaccinated with the Chinese vaccine. And this caused a real kind of tension in that particular relationship, because the public got very agitated. They said, what's going on? You gave us this stuff, it doesn't work, and actually our people are dying. This is terrible. And that kind of complexity is something that I think you see across the region, where you see initially there was kind of a surge of positivity. China's doing something, no one else is, we need help. And then when it went wrong, there's that sort of surge in the other direction. Now, the interesting here in Singapore, where I'm sat, is that it's gone in a really funny way in all sorts of ways. So here we've had an issue where there was, the Singaporean government is a very rich government, and certainly by regional standards, very much more affluent. They bought a lot of vaccines from other countries and brought those in, not the Chinese one. And actually, initially, the Singaporean authorities had not, cleared the Chinese vaccine. They said it's not as good as the other one, so we're not going to accept it for public use. But here you have a very strong, large ethnic Chinese community who are very connected into WeChat, very connected into the discourses in China. And a lot of them really refused the Western vaccines, because they said, no, we're hearing on WeChat in our sort of social media world that actually this is poison and we want the Chinese one. And so they were calling for the Chinese one and wanting it, when the government was saying, well, you shouldn't really use it because it's not a good one. And it's created this sort of odd dichotomy where, on the one hand, the Singaporean government has left basically travel to China is open. It's very easy if you want to travel to China from Singapore. Once you're in China, of course, you have to do 3 weeks quarantine, so no one really wants to do it. But if you're coming from China into Singapore, it's easy to do. There's no sort of quarantine, no restriction. There haven't been for a very long time. But on the other hand, the government has basically been pushing back quite, subtly but pointedly against Chinese vaccines as opposed to others. And I think that kind of interesting dichotomy, where on the one hand, they're trying to maintain the relationship with China and sort of stay open, but on the other hand, recognizing the practical problems that it does potentially pose and trying to balance against them. And I think this kind of dichotomy is something that you kind of see echoed across the region in different ways. And I say the experience in Indonesia is very positive and then very negative is one expression of it. And I think what you've seen here in Singapore is another side. But over to you, Andrew. How's the wider COVID diplomacy scene from your family context down under?
Yeah, I am Australian, but Australia has closed borders, and my home state still has quarantine policies, so I haven't been back. But I just did want to point out that the COVID pandemic and the associated vaccine diplomacy has probably been an example of where you can have some healthy strategic competition in the region. The Quad, for example, which has generally been a security dialogue, it was sort of born as a security dialogue. I think it's still called the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. It's now the leaders are meeting at the top leader level, but they put vaccine diplomacy on their agenda after the pandemic, and in direct response to China's vaccine diplomacy efforts. Now, the question about the efficacy of the vaccines and the scale and the timing of the rollout. Believe that the Quad vaccine diplomacy has been relatively sluggish. So we can argue about the extent to which it's been successful, but at least it's one example of where strategic competition can occur in the region, and it can actually potentially lead to positive outcomes. Countries can compete strategically, but in a way that actually brings benefits or stands to bring benefits to people in the region. The other point was just about the impact of pandemic on dialogues and interstate dialogues. I'm afraid I just wanted to kick it back to you, Raf, in Singapore very briefly, because I wondered whether, I know a lot of the ASEAN's kind of like a central talk shop for the region. It sort of positions itself in that role, organizes most of the major regional dialogues. And many of them made a successful online transition, but how has that been viewed from within the region? Has the transition to online dialogues been seen as a successful one? Has it had unexpected benefits or downsides?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I haven't particularly noticed the discourse about it, frankly, being perceived as a negative. I think generally what I would anecdotally observe is that I certainly see that, you know, colleagues, think tanks and researchers in the region loved the kind of shift online because it meant suddenly an ability to engage with European and Americans in a more regular fashion than frankly you could before. I think within the region, I mean, you know, I think it was an easy transition to make, and I suspect it's going to be an easy transition to make out of. Ultimately, this region is quite well connected now in terms of aviation, and, you know, it's not that hard to sort of get around Southeast Asia. So I would suspect that it's not, you know, I don't know that it's materially changed it, let's say, in that particular way. But, you know, I think I've certainly seen a positive, you know, and I suspect this plays in an ASEAN level as well, right? I mean, I think if we think of some recent ASEAN meetings where I've seen some quite senior American figures participate, I know the US didn't always show up to every meeting there. I think it's much easier for them to do that now. And so I think that does change things in a positive way. And I think it changes things really for the outside powers to be able to participate, probably at a more senior level than they might do otherwise, you know, because it's just a case of going to your office and turning on the computer rather than, you know, getting on a flight and crossing the world. So I think that is probably a benefit. Now, how that's been seen in the region, I think they would, I suspect the view would be wait and see if this translates into more commitment going forwards as well, when normality does return. It has been observed that, you know, there are some foreign ministers, for example, the British one, who did actually come out to Singapore, you know, during the pandemic. So, you know, the ones who do make the trip, it is still seen in a positive light, and just kind of showing up in person does make a difference. So I think it's given outside powers an ability to reach into these conversations in a way that maybe they previously hadn't. I think the question of what the benefit or not of it is if coming out of the pandemic and we go back to in-person meetings, if they still show up, or if it turns out it's just they're not actually that interested, it was just easier to do it.
Well, I mean, that sort of reminds me of the days when we used to have these conferences in person. And I mean, we wouldn't have been able to have you here, Raf, and probably not you either, Andrew. So I'm very grateful for both of your times today. And we're just going to relaunch that poll now to see if anyone's opinions have changed over the course of the last hour. I think there's so many different avenues through which we can discuss the Indo-Pacific and the changing dynamics and the evolution of the relationships around the region. It leaves much food for thought, and there's going to be so many more of these same conversations happening at different points in the future. So with that, I will let the poll run out. I will say thank you very much and goodbye to Raf and Andrew. Please hang around if you'd like to see the last half an hour, and I will hand back to Michael.